On March 30th, 1867, something happened that is still surrounded by myths and arguments to this day. The Russian Empire sold Alaska to the United States. A lot of people still believe it wasn't really a sale, but some kind of lease, that the land was practically given away, or that the money never even made it to the Treasury. That's exactly what this story is about. Why Alaska was sold and what was really behind it. To understand that, you first have to understand what Alaska actually was and how it ended up as part of the Russian Empire in the first place. The word Alaska comes from the Aleut language and means great land, which honestly fits perfectly. It's huge. Kodiak Island, for example, is the second largest island in the United States after Hawaii. The whole region stretches for nearly 1,700 kilometers. Alaska is washed by both the Arctic and Pacific Oceans. Its mainland portion is a peninsula about 700 kilometers long. It's a mountainous land with a huge number of volcanoes, more than the rest of the United States combined. The area was originally inhabited by native peoples, Aleuts, Eskimos, and Indians. They lived by hunting, fishing, and the fur trade, harvesting fur seals, sea lions, seals, and sea otters. The waters were also full of fish, from salmon to cod and herring. About 41,440 square kilometers are covered by glaciers, roughly the size of the Netherlands. So this was not just some distant outpost, it was an enormous territory. It's believed that the first Europeans to see the shores of Alaska were members of Semyon Dezhnev's expedition in 1648. According to the traditional account, they passed through what is now known as the Bering Strait from the Arctic into the Pacific, but they never actually landed in Alaska. They only saw the coastline. After that, Alaska faded from attention for a while. Things changed under Peter the Great. As soon as circumstances allowed, Peter ordered the exploration of Russia's Pacific frontier and sent out Bering's expedition. Bering sailed through the same strait Dezhnev had passed through, but because visibility was poor, he never clearly saw the North American continent. Alaska was officially discovered later. In 1732, the ship St. Gabriel, commanded by Mikhail Gvozdev, passed through the Bering Strait, and that was when Russians first set foot on Alaskan soil. From that point on, the land was recorded and claimed for the Russian crown. After the expedition returned, interest cooled again for a while. Fyodorov died soon afterward, and Alaska once again slipped into the background. But in 1741, Vitus Bering's expedition reached the Aleutian chain. Russians encountered the local population there, Aleuts, Eskimos, and Indians. They were lightly armed and at first generally peaceful. That was the beginning of Alaska's active development. As usually happens with newly discovered lands, merchants and adventurers were the first to rush in. The reason was obvious. Fish, furs, and a rich hunting trade meant serious money. The next big step was the creation of the Russian-American Company. In essence, it was Russia's version of the big colonial companies used by European powers, created specifically to develop Alaska, extract whatever valuable resources it could, and sell them for profit across the empire. The company grew quickly. Russian merchants and traders began actively developing the North American coast. Native peoples hunted animals for furs, the furs were purchased from them and then shipped onward. The Russian-American Company gained a monopoly over that trade and brought in enormous profits. Many sources describe it as the most profitable company in the Russian Empire. Gold and oil would eventually be found in Alaska too, but at that time oil had almost no real significance yet, and the gold rush would come much later after the empire was gone from the region. For the time being, Russians pushed farther down the coast toward San Francisco and established outposts there. That's how Fort Ross came into being, first as Fort Rumyantsev, then as a Russian foothold in California. By the early 19th century, what became known as Russian America had taken shape. Russian merchants traded with San Francisco, bringing furs, bone whale, whale oil, and even ice. Ice was big business back then. It was needed in storage houses, restaurants, and anywhere food had to be kept cool in the summer. Huge blocks of ice were cut in Alaska and shipped to California. In return, the colonies received the things they needed to survive: food, gunpowder, bullets, and other goods Alaska itself couldn't provide. The colonial system developed fast. In 1808, Fort Rumyantsev was established, and by 1853, a steamship had already been launched in Novo-Arkansk, built entirely on-site without imported parts from Russia. The Orthodox Church was also active, expanding its presence in the region. Overall, it looked like a success story. Two of the main figures in that story were Alexander Baranov and Grigory Shelikov, the men who organized the Russian-American Company and laid the foundation for the whole enterprise. They stood at the beginning of what many considered the empire's most successful company. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Indian groups attacked from time to time, there were clashes over fur prices and over the expansion of Russian settlements onto native lands. Some of those conflicts were extremely bloody. But overall, the colonists were able to beat back those attacks. Then gold entered the picture, and American settlers started coming into Alaska. For them, the land was right there, nearby. They came to pan for gold and settle down. At first, Russians and Americans coexisted pretty peacefully. In fact, during the American War of Independence, the Russian Empire had supported the Americans. Over time, that became an important basis for relations between the two countries. Russia saw the United States as a logical ally against Great Britain, and the Americans viewed Russia in much the same way. But by the middle of the 19th century, things started to shift. The main problem was the sea otter, a marine animal with extremely valuable fur, thick and oily enough to repel water. Sea otters were hunted in massive numbers, and by the middle of the century, the trade had almost collapsed. That had been one of the key sources of income, and when it dried up, the entire economic foundation of Russian America started to crumble. The Russian-American Company went from being wildly profitable to heading toward bankruptcy. By the time Alaska was sold, its debt to the state had reached 722,000 gold rubles. At the same time, the company's monopoly was weakening. Other merchants were buying furs from local people at better prices. Meanwhile, control of the colonies was shifting away from merchants and into the hands of naval officers, many of whom knew very little about trade. Bureaucracy increased, supply chains broke down, pricing became inefficient, and the merchants were pushed out of leadership. From there, things started falling apart. At the same time, Russia was actively developing the Amur and Primorye regions in the Far East. That's where the empire's main attention was now focused. Those territories seemed more important and more practical. They were part of the same mainland, while Alaska was on another continent. In St. Petersburg, attention shifted eastward, and Alaska increasingly looked less like a source of income and more like an expensive burden. American prospectors were moving into the territory more and more aggressively. In 1853, Governor-General Muravyov-Umursky of eastern Siberia wrote a memo to the emperor stating bluntly that the Russian Empire would inevitably lose Alaska. In his view, the territory no longer made much economic sense, while the United States was growing stronger and had already bought Louisiana from France and Texas from Mexico. He believed the United States would naturally keep trying to round out its territory. Russia, meanwhile, would be unable either to hold Alaska or to wage war for it if conflict came. It was simply too far away and too difficult to reinforce. Then came the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, which devastated the Treasury. The empire was forced to seek a foreign loan of 42 million rubles because the budget had fallen into a deficit. In that situation, the United States looked even more valuable as a potential ally against Great Britain. In 1857, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, the brother of Alexander II, wrote that the United States would sooner or later take those colonies anyway, and that Russia would not be able to get them back. In his words, the colonies were already bringing in little benefit, and losing them would not be terribly painful. After reading the note, Alexander II wrote on it, "This idea is worth considering." Talks with the Americans began, but they were soon interrupted by the outbreak of the American Civil War. Russia supported the federal government during that war, strengthening ties with the United States even more. But meanwhile, conditions in Alaska were getting worse. Food supplies became unreliable, deliveries became increasingly difficult, and local resources could not fully support the population. On top of that, Indian tribes began uniting, and conflicts with Russian settlers became even more serious and bloody. On December 16, 1866, a final meeting on Alaska was held. Present were the Emperor, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, Foreign Minister Alexander Gorchakov, Naval Minister Nikolai Krabbe, Finance Minister Mikhail Reitern, and Edward de Stokel, the Russian envoy in Washington. Stokel played a major role in the whole affair. He reported that the Americans were not exactly eager to buy Alaska. They had plenty of problems of their own and were more focused on California and the South. So, in his view, the deal would need to be pushed actively, through the press and through bribes. Around $120,000 was set aside for that purpose. It's important to remember that by then the Monroe Doctrine already existed, one of the foundational ideas of American foreign policy. Under it, the Western Hemisphere was considered off-limits to further European colonization, and any European move in that direction was treated as a threat to U.S. interests. So, in St. Petersburg, the assumption was that the Americans would want this territory sooner or later anyway. Stokel went to Washington with instructions to sell Alaska for no less than $5 million. For comparison, Louisiana had been bought for $15 million, and California had effectively cost the same, so $5 million looked reasonable enough. Not everyone in America supported the deal. Newspapers mocked the purchase, saying the country was buying 50,000 Eskimos who had half a bucket of seal oil for breakfast. But Stokel was effective. He handed out bribes, worked the press, and coordinated with Secretary of State William Seward, who strongly supported the purchase, even while being criticized for it. At one point in St. Petersburg, there was even discussion of suggesting to the Americans that Alaska had other potential buyers. There were reports that the territory had supposedly even been offered to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Whether that actually happened, or whether it later became part of the mythology, is still unclear. Negotiations began on March 5, 1867, and lasted for several weeks. In the end, the United States agreed. The treaty was signed on March 30th, 1867. The Americans received a massive territory, more than 1.5 million square kilometers. The price was $7.2 million. If you break it down by area, that came out to about 5 cents per hectare. On April 19th, the leadership of the Russian-American Company was informed that the territory no longer belonged to Russia. On May 3rd, the treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate. And on October 18, 1867, at 3:30 p.m. local time, Alaska officially became part of the United States. There's a dramatic legend about the handover ceremony. Supposedly, the Russian flag got tangled on the flagpole. A sailor climbed up to remove it and fell directly onto Russian bayonets. Another version says the American flag also refused to go up properly. It got tangled in the ropes. The wind tore at it, as if Alaska itself did not want to leave. But American accounts describe the ceremony as dry and simple. The sides signed papers, shook hands, and that was that. The Russian Empire retained ownership of Orthodox churches and religious property. The Americans preserved church holdings and agreed to provide archival records when needed: birth, marriage, and similar records. That mattered because there was an Orthodox population in Alaska, including among native peoples. Right after the transfer, American troops entered Sitka. There are reports that soldiers looted St. Michael's Cathedral along with some homes and shops. The final check for the territory was handed to Stoical on August 1, 1868. In America, reaction to the purchase was mixed. Some saw it as smart, others as pointless. In Russia, the sale was widely seen as a defeat. The negotiations had been kept under extreme secrecy, and the public did not learn the full details right away. Once reports started leaking into the press, criticism followed quickly. Publisher Andrei Krajewski, for example, angrily asked whether the fruits of the labor of Shelikov, Baranov, Khlebnikov, and other devoted men were really going to benefit foreigners. A bitter saying even appeared: they sold the tea warehouse. That was when the myth of a 99-year lease seems to have really taken off. It was a convenient story. It softened the sense of defeat and allowed people to imagine that one day the land would come back. But there are no documents supporting any lease. The transfer was a sale, plain and simple. The deal sharply boosted the international standing of the United States. In Great Britain and France, it was seen as a blow. The British press openly wrote about a Russian-American conspiracy against the British Crown. You could say that the Alaska Purchase marked the beginning of a noticeable rise in America's international stature. Another layer of myth centers on the money. One of the most popular stories is that the Treasury never actually saw it. According to the legend, Stoical gave part of it away in bribes, pocketed another part, and the rest was sent to Britain, where the dollars were exchanged for gold, loaded on a ship called the Orkney, and then lost when the vessel exploded and sank. But that story is a myth. Yes, $120,000 really did go toward bribes and press influence, but the bulk of the money was used to buy parts for railroads. The funds went into construction of the Kursk-Kiev, Ryazan-Kozlov, and Moscow-Ryazan railway lines. On the scale of the imperial treasury, it was not some mind-blowing fortune. The empire's overall expenses were around 400 million rubles. But if you remember that the government was looking for loans totaling 45 million, then the amount starts to look more meaningful. The later fate of Alaska is well known. In 1880, a major ore deposit was discovered at Juneau. In the early 20th century, large gold deposits were found. That triggered the gold rush so famously described by Jack London. By the mid-1980s, nearly 1,000 tons of gold had been extracted from Alaska in total. Today, Alaska ranks second in the United States after Nevada in gold production and second in oil production. Gas deposits were also discovered there. The Red Dog mine alone accounts for 10% of global zinc production. By some estimates, by the 1920s, Alaska had already brought the United States $200 million in profit. But none of that could be clearly foreseen at the time of the sale. Oil did not yet matter the way it does now, and those large gold deposits had not yet been found. As for the population, most Russian colonists left Alaska after the sale. But according to one version, around 200 people remained behind. Either they were not evacuated in time or simply left there. They accepted American citizenship. To this day, descendants of Russian colonists still live in Alaska and California. The Russian Orthodox Church also remained and continued sending missionaries there. The myth of the 99-year lease got a second life in the 20th century. When Alaska became the 49th U.S. state on January 3, 1959, people began saying once again that the lease term had ended. Some even claimed Khrushchev and Kennedy had discussed Alaska's return, but no documents support that. In 2013, there was even a lawsuit filed in a Moscow arbitration court claiming America had underpaid Alaska, but the case was refused on the merits. That's the story of Alaska. Its sale was driven by a whole cluster of reasons: geography, the development of the Amur region, foreign policy, the desire to strengthen ties with the United States, economic strain, the decline of the Russian-American company, and the growing realization that holding the territory in the long run would be extremely difficult. The decision was made consciously and deliberately. From the point of view of the 19th century, what was sold was a territory that might very well have been lost for free anyway. Time later showed that where there once were sea otters, there would eventually be gold, oil, and gas, but nobody knew that yet. Alaska was sold by Alexander II, and it was exactly that, a sale, not a lease.